Hello, and welcome to the ThinkJSOU webinar series, brought to you by the Office for Strategic Engagement. Today, we are pleased to present a distinguished speaker. This session is unclassified and will be recorded and posted to the JSOU network. Please keep in mind that the views and opinions expressed by all participants do not necessarily reflect the views, opinions, or policy of the U.S. government, Department of Defense, or USSOCOM. If you have questions after this session, please email thinkjsou@jsou.edu.
All right, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for another ThinkJSOU event. For those joining us over Zoom, just a reminder, please to mute yourself. For questions, you're always welcome to include them in the chat, and we have someone moderating them, so we'll be sure to get to them. I would like to thank you all again for joining us. By way of introduction, this is going to be a book talk about this excellent book, Contesting France Intelligence and U.S. Foreign Policy in the Early Cold War by Dr. Susan Perlman. And Dr. Perlman is a professor of intelligence studies and history at National Intelligence University and also the provost. At this point, it would probably be convenient to say that the views and everything we talk about are our own, and they don't represent the views of our mutual institutions, Joint Special Operations University, National Intelligence University, the U.S. government, ODNI, and Department of Defense. Did I get everything?
I think so.
Dr. Perlman, aside from being the provost, previously she was an Air Force officer and then started her academic career at American University in Washington, D.C. She has received awards for teaching and excellence, the the Berlin Award?
Beelan,
Beelan Award for Memorial Award for academic teaching and excellence. She has published extensively in U.S. foreign relations and intelligence history, and her most recent publication is this book that we're going to discuss. And I just wanted to start by saying, intelligence is still to an extent overlooked in how it influences government and U.S. foreign policy. And what I enjoyed most about the book is Dr. Perlman did a fantastic job of explaining how intelligence influenced U.S. foreign policy, not just contemporary U.S. foreign policy, but with ripple effects. And what we're going to talk about today is really formative to the Cold War, how intelligence with a country, France, an ally at the time, got involved in what today we're calling great power competition, and took us from a point where it wasn't clear exactly what the nature of the Cold War was going to be, and actually helped spark the Cold War to a certain extent, set the conditions for a conflict in Vietnam and U.S. involvement in Vietnam. And so, by way of beginning, I'd like to ask Dr. Perlman to set the stage for us, because we have this view that the Cold War was inevitable. And so where does France enter this picture? Where was France in 1944? And what was the status of U.S., or rather Franco-American relations, and then their relationship with the other big ally in the room, the Soviet Union?
I appreciate, first of all, I want to say thank you for the invitation to talk to you all today about my research. This is actually the first opportunity I've had to talk about it, so you all are the guinea pigs in this process. But to answer Jeff's question, France, and I'll just back up too, because really all of this research in this book is a look at how intelligence informs foreign policy more broadly, but I did it through a historical case. So the U.S.-French relations from 1944 to 1947 is the case. So I have the historical record and the intelligence record that I can look at to give us some insight. And what I found is that a lot of the dynamics that existed then still exist today. So that's what's particularly interesting, even though intelligence really as a practice and as a profession have evolved so much. But by way of background, France in 1944, so if I could back up even more than that, France, as you all know, collapsed in 1940 in 6 weeks after the Nazi onslaught. So that was particularly surprising to the United States. U.S. foreign policy officials that France had collapsed in the way that it did. Part of that was because there was not a full appreciation, perhaps, in the cost that France had endured in the First World War. So they had lost an entire generation of men. And here they are fighting the Germans again 30 years later. So France collapses in 6 weeks. Most of France was ultimately occupied by Germany over time. So there was the Vichy collaborationist regime that was set up, and then there were others who went on to resist. And those resistors started off in London under the leadership of General Charles de Gaulle, who would ultimately become the president of the French provisional government after the war, and then later president of France in 1958. And so by 1944, you've had this dynamic that's played out. There's a resistance. There's also a collaborationist regime. So the United States is kind of figuring out who are we going to deal with. I want to back up here and say that the communists in France were out of the picture. They didn't want to take part in what they saw as a war of capitalist powers until the Soviet Union was invaded in July of 1941. So at that point, the Soviet Union says to their allies in the French Communist Party, it's now time to fight, and so they join the resistance. So at first, the call to resistance in June of 1940 is really de Gaulle and his compatriots, but later the communists join, and they were a major part of the resistance. So now you have these two factions that would perhaps have not normally worked together. They're working together in the resistance, and you have other factions that are represented in the collaborationist regime. The United States is trying to figure out where to throw in their lot. So we still had representation with Vichy. In fact, some of the people who would advise President Truman later had been attachés to the Vichy government, or even an ambassador to the Vichy government. So there was a sense that perhaps we could deal with Vichy, but here's this resistance that is asking for our assistance. And so we can, and I know we'll talk about it more later, but really you had US intelligence at the time that was kind of divided between dealing with some of these different factions. They had a different appreciation for what was going on inside France. And so ultimately, of course, the Allies win the war, and de Gaulle comes back into France as the leader of the resistance, and they march and liberate Paris, mainly because Eisenhower had given them to go ahead to do that. But I would just say the Cold War was, in my estimation, already firmly playing out in France in terms of the different factions inside of France, but also with the French communist affiliation with the Soviet Union. So if I talk a little bit about how the Soviets fit into all of this, as I just mentioned, the French Communist Party, I'll call them the PCF, did not join the war until July of 1941. At that point, the Grand Alliance is fully in effect. But there were already fissures in the Grand Alliance between the United States, the British, and the Soviets in particular. Some of that had to do with old scores that had to be settled. The United States had in one of its early covert operations under the Wilson administration to prop up white Russians who were antagonistic to the new Bolshevik regime in 1918 and 1919. Stalin didn't necessarily forget that. There had been a number of wartime issues between the Allies that played out in terms of opening a second front. Stalin was asking for it because the Soviets were bearing the brunt of the fighting on the Eastern Front. And so that was a particular point of tension, and that starts to really boil over in 1945 when you have Roosevelt, who thought that he could deal with Stalin, obviously dies and leaves the scene in April of 1945. We have a new president who does not approach Stalin in the same way and is highly suspicious of him. In May of 1945, the United States moves to cut off Lend-Lease to the Soviets, at least for a time, and that was a particular problem. And then you have the issue of the atomic bomb and whether we ultimately decide we're going to fill in the Soviets on this new great weapon that we have. So there were all of these underlying issues. The French communists are positioning themselves at liberation in August of 1944 to have a predominant role in France. And you have the Soviets, the Grand Alliance is starting to break apart a bit, and once the war is over, a lot of the reasons to keep them together no longer exist.
So just like today, we have a very easy, not complex international environment. And that's where the role of intelligence comes in. Intelligence is ultimately supposed to provide decision advantage, perhaps simplify some of the big questions that policymakers have. But reading through the book, there were competing pictures that the US intelligence community, as it was at the time, put together. So I was hoping you could then, having set this stage with the sort of international actors and domestic politics in France, what was the situation like with American intelligence? Who were the key players in the room, both in terms of organizations, perhaps personalities, and what was their relationship with France?
Okay. All right, so US intelligence obviously, and Jeff knows this better than anybody since he's got a great manuscript on the history of US intelligence, but We'd like to think about the U.S. intelligence community today, and a lot of people often assume that U.S. intelligence really begins at the Second World War, because there has not historically been a lot that's been written about U.S. intelligence in the American Revolution or the Civil War or even World War I, but we know that it existed. But the United States has had an ebb and flow with intelligence, whereas if it's a wartime crisis situation, then intelligence gins up, and then when the war is over, there's a return to the status quo. And that was true after the end of the First World War. So the Military Intelligence Division, which was a major Army, in particular, military intelligence operation, had played an important role in the First World War, and then it collapses down to just a few people, I think even just a handful, to look out over the entire globe, if you will. So the Second World War starts. There's an appreciation that obviously there's a crisis coming. The United States isn't formally involved yet, and so President Roosevelt agrees to establish the Coordinator of Information, and he made that William Donovan, who I know everybody in here loves and adores, and I do myself. So there were still some military intelligence organizations. The COI, which ultimately becomes the OSS, was a key player, obviously, during the Second World War. My book predominantly focuses on the human and analysis kind of part of things, but there were obviously already some signals intelligence aspects to the Second World War. But what is particularly interesting is that there was already the interplay between these different types of organizations. The FBI was already in existence. And what's interesting to think about with the FBI is that it's a domestic organization, but it still maintained that it should have control over Latin America and activities that were going on in Latin America. So you had these different fiefdoms that were out there, and a lot of these organizations that were directly in competition with each other over the course of the war. So did I? Yeah. And then you asked about, what was the second part of your question?
And what was the relationship with each other? Can you describe, amicable? Was it community?
So this is, and this will kind of sound familiar to those of you who might have operated in the intelligence community lately, but there was quite a bit of competition, even though the resources were fairly infinite given the existential crisis that the Second World War presented. But you had certain organizations that wanted to keep the OSS out and wouldn't provide them with certain kinds of intelligence. So the OSS didn't have access to signals intelligence, for example. The FBI wanted to keep the OSS out of Latin America. And military intelligence in particular felt threatened by the OSS. And so skipping ahead a little bit to the end of the Second World War, one of the things that's particularly interesting is that there was a concerted campaign on the part of military intelligence organizations and the FBI to discredit Donovan and the OSS. That certainly played a role in President Truman's decision ultimately to disband the OSS in September of 1945.
And this is perfect background to then get into how they analyzed or how they collected and analyzed in France and conducted intelligence. And that's something that I want to emphasize too for the audience. Something that I got as someone who studies intelligence from the book is you really are emphasizing the importance of what remains core duties of intelligence officers in terms of collection and figuring out who their sources are, vetting their sources, thinking about biases, their own biases, and then analysis, doing the same thing. And so could you then, referring back to some of the organizations you just discussed, what were their sources in France, and how did they go about feeding that into the analytical machine in their respective organizations?
Okay. So one of the things that I found, and if I get even back up a little bit more in terms of why I decided to write this particular book, one of the things as a historian of Franco-American relations I found interesting was that there seemed to be this narrative about France at the end of the Second World War, that it was weak, that it was poised on the edge of a communist revolution, and that there was this kind of heightened perception of threat surrounding France. And I often wondered if that was entirely true. It just seemed to be an accepted narrative in all of the histories. So one of the things you can do is you look back at the diplomatic record, which was one way of thinking about it. But I decided to look at the intelligence record alongside the diplomatic record. And what I found was pretty interesting. And the biggest point here is that the narrative about France is weak, poised on the tip of revolution, was actually deeply contested at the time, hence the title. And that was something that we hadn't fully appreciated, and why that was so. And so one of the things that I did is I went back and looked at the intelligence, and because this is so early in American intelligence history, they had not yet figured out about redacting their sources or not revealing their sources. So they would clearly, on some of their documents, I talked to this guy, here's his name, here's his background. And so you could start to reconstitute, if you will, some of these networks of sources that the different agencies were using. And you also had enough information about them that you could figure out where they were coming from. They might have a particular political affiliation. They might have an interest in restoring the old French government after the end of the Second World War, or personal interests. So I was able to take some time to reconstruct those. And what I found is that there were essentially two discrete groups of informants for US intelligence. On the one hand, you had the US Embassy that was operating in Paris, which returned to Paris in 1944. The ambassador there was Ambassador Jefferson Caffrey. I bring up the Department of State here because this was a period when the intelligence profession was still forming to some degree. And so the ambassador and his staff in the embassy often basically worked as intelligence analysts, if you will, and gatherers. So you had the embassy in Paris, you had military intelligence who had similar sources. And those sources were from the French military. They were from a number who had collaborated with the Nazis, some of whom had left France in 1940 and gone to the United States. And from there, they advocated for their particular interests. Some of them were pre-war politicians who had been discredited by their collaboration or because they had voted full powers to Philippe Pétain, who would ultimately lead the collaborationist government. And they had a particular interest in their minds. First of all, a lot of them wanted to restore themselves to a position of authority in the aftermath of the Second World War. So they were advocating for themselves as we are the future of France. Some of them were industrialists who were seriously afraid of communist workers who might rise up. And they were typically more elite in terms of their status in French society and often more conservative. Some of them even harbored fascist right-wing sympathies. On the other hand, you had a group of informants that informed the OSS. And what's particularly interesting about the OSS's informants is how the OSS was positioned. So they had more access inside France rather than immigrants who were meeting with military intelligence units in New York, for example. The OSS had a station in Bern, Switzerland, and that was a place where a lot of people and money were transitioning in and out of France for the resistance. So they were meeting resistors there. They had contacts inside the resistance. A lot of the OSS officers at the time had come from academia. So some of them were experts in France. They had been teaching at Harvard or Princeton before the war. They had been brought in. They had the language. They had lived in France for a time. They had those kinds of contacts. And so it was through a different set of contacts that was deeply connected to the resistance, whether it was communist or non-communist resistance, fed them a different story about what was going on in France. And whereas the other group had perhaps argued that the United States should intervene once France was liberated and help set up a government, there was another group that said, nope, we need your help, but we want to be able to set up our own government. We think that Charles de Gaulle is the man to lead France versus having an occupation kind of government. So it's particularly interesting that there were these two kinds of narratives that were based on information that was coming from French sources that were feeding two narratives that were weaving through the different intelligence organizations and ultimately making their way to the president, at least for a time, until the OSS was marginalized and one narrative basically wins out, the Cold War narrative that we're all familiar with, worried about French collapse again.
And along with that French collapse, the idea was who was hastening it? Was it this a domestic situation in France? You mentioned the French Communist Party and how popular it was at the time. Were they externally supported by the Soviets? Certainly at the time, the fear was that the Soviets had their hand in everything. They had penetrated American intelligence, actually, and British intelligence. So what was the interaction or relationship between the French Communist Party and the Soviet Union to the extent that we know? Was it, again, symbiotic? Was it separate? Were the French communists actively being directed by the Soviet Union? And was that direction for subversion, sabotage? to win the government through domestic politics and elections. So, we talked about America and France. Now, perhaps we can talk a little bit more about the Soviet Union and France.
Okay. Yeah, so this is a matter of debate for many historians, and this is one that I weigh in in the book. But the French Communist Party, just as a bit of background, had split off from the French Socialist Party in 1920. At one point, they were all one. The communists split off. And then you have a period of the Communist International. So this is when the Soviet Union is advocating worldwide revolution in the 1930s, and the French Communist Party is fully in line with the Soviet Union. And so there was evidence that there were propaganda activities. There were a number of front organizations that had been set up, especially in Paris. So Soviet intelligence was particularly active in France, both trying to influence government propaganda, but also the gathering of intelligence, but also looking at dissidents inside France. And that would become a problem again after the Second World War. So in terms of the direction of the French Communist Party, it does go in phases in terms of there was pretty heavy collaboration in the 1930s until France has a popular front government in which the communists and the socialists are in government together, partly as a reaction to what's going on now in Nazi Germany. With the end of or with the beginning of the war in 1939, that kind of collapses. The French Communist Party is obviously quiescent during the initial days of the war until the Soviet Union is invaded. So I would also say that we have to remember that France and the Soviet Union, France, Russia, have a historic relationship in terms of alliances. They had obviously been on the same team in the First World War until then Russia pulls itself out in 1917, which was obviously a point of major concern for the Allies. And again, France and the Soviet Union are on the same side in the Second World War, to the point where the Soviets were so worried about putting off the Allies that they disbanded the Communist International in 1943 because they didn't want this idea of worldwide revolution to cause a problem in the Grand Alliance. So at that point, everybody seems to be working in concert. But it's when the jockeying starts to happen in 1944 on the eve of liberation for France that there's a concern about what the French communists might do and what the Soviets are doing through the French communists. And all of these rumors started to circulate that there was going to be a coup, that the French communists were going to take the opportunity of liberation to rise up, take over the government, and establish a communist regime. There are still historians today who believe that that was the intent. I don't think there is any evidence that that was the intent. All of the evidence points to the fact that French communists, while they may have disagreed with de Gaulle, and they were certainly not of like minds, that they were united in defeating the Nazis. And they had agreed, although there was a disagreement over whether there should be an insurrection to throw out the Nazis or whether there should be part of a military liberation that de Gaulle advocated, they agreed that they were all going to manage it as one united resistance. But once liberation happens, again, that jockeying becomes particularly problematic. What's also interesting, if I can extend this conversation a bit to the colonies, France also had colonies during this time in North Africa, to include Algeria, which was not a colony. It was actually considered part of France. And they also had colonies in what we think of today as Vietnam, but Indochina, as they called it. And so there was a deep connection between events in the metropole in France and what was going on in the colonies. And so there was always some fear, too, that there was going to be this communist insurrection and that there might also be these national liberation movements that are brewing in the aftermath of the Second World War that are communist-inspired. So there was a lot of reason for American officials to be concerned, but there's been no evidence that any of that kind of activity was directed by the Soviet Union. And the reason we know that is that the Soviets were so weak at the end of the Second World War, they were not yet poised to be able to challenge the United States militarily, and they wanted to keep the peace. They did not support national liberation movements in the way that you might think in 1945, 46, and even 1947. That came later. And they certainly tried not to antagonize some of their allies until it became apparent that the Cold War, which had existed for a long time, was really becoming this intractable kind of ideological conflict.
And I'm very glad you mentioned the colonies, and also in the context of French, because this is a hugely important point for Cold War history, because this is where we see the making of the idea of the communist monolith in American policymakers, that communism is monolithic, domino theory, sort of, you can look at the antecedents here. You know, if one country's communist, that means Soviet communism. They're all working together. And so what you've already dispelled is this notion that at least the French Communist Party was working directly for, where they're a proxy of the Soviet Union. So to then extend that to, say, French Indochina, for instance, what was the relationship there? And especially one piece of OSS history is they worked with Ho Chi Minh. Mm-hmm. And so you start to look at this picture of where American policymakers were getting their information from, how they were building, you know, policymaker image of the world is hugely important, how they perceive the world. So what we're really getting at here is how intelligence helped feed policymaker perceptions of the world. So using Vietnam or Indochina at the time as an example, what was the American involvement with that particular French colony, their involvement with Ho Chi Minh, perhaps Ho Chi Minh's relationship with the Soviet Union, and then France's intentions and American intentions for the fate of Indochina after the war?
Okay. Yeah, so as you pointed out, Indochina had been occupied. The Vichy regime, it was obviously French Indochina. The Vichy regime takes over once the war starts. And there was always some maneuvering behind the scenes whether the resistance was going to be able to do anything to actually regain the particular colonies for the resistance rather than for the collaborationist regime. The United States had some interest in Indochina, obviously, because of the coming war with Japan. They wanted help with downed airmen if they needed to be evacuated outside of Indochina. They also wanted intelligence. And so the United States had a number of different intelligence networks inside of Indochina. The OSS was excluded to some degree by General MacArthur because he did not want to work with a unit that he could not control, and Donovan refused to give over control to him. But the OSS did have missions inside of Indochina in support of downed airmen and also the intelligence collection. And there were also some other groups that they were working with. There was one called the GBT group, which was a collection of businessmen. I think there was a Chinese businessman, there was a Canadian oil man, and one other operative that had been running a bit of an intelligence network inside of Indochina that the OSS had a kind of tenuous relationship and was taking advantage of for that kind of information. And so at this point, the United States is purely looking at it as, we're going to work with whoever we can to defeat the Japanese and the Nazis. And if that means working with Vietnamese communists, then that's absolutely appropriate and fine. So you had these DEER team missions for the OSS that go in and parachute and meet with Ho Chi Minh to this end. What's interesting as an aside about Ho Chi Minh is Ho Chi Minh was a communist. There's no doubt about that, but he was a nationalist above all, and he was perfectly happy to work with the United States. And there's some apocryphal stories about meeting some of these OSS DEER team members and playing the U.S. national anthem and waving the American flag as a show of support for the United States. So he too was also looking at a way that he could throw off his, the Vietnamese had to worry about Chinese occupiers for a long time. They were certainly worried about Vichy, and then they were worried about Japanese occupiers and what would happen in the post-war. Would they become independent from France? So the Vietnamese were very much working with the United States. So in March of 1945, the Japanese launch a coup against the Vichy regime and take over the government in Indochina. And this is at a point where some of even the Vichy, parts of the Vichy regime start to move into resistance. So at that point, all intelligence from Indochina is knocked out, with the exception of the Viet Minh, so Vietnamese communists, so Ho Chi Minh's group. All the other groups, the GBT group that I was talking about, intelligence picture has basically disappeared overnight. So they become really important for the United States. And so the United States continues to work with them, but the French are becoming a little bit more agitated about it because they see that this is a group that perhaps has these liberation ideas at the end of the war, and perhaps there are some other groups that the United States would be better working with, and they're kind of warning them about working with Ho Chi Minh's group. Now, as the war kind of ends, then there's a question of independence for Vietnam. And obviously the Vietnamese are advocating for that. We see this in a number of different colonies who had been promised liberation after the First World War, only to have it not happen. And then they're hoping now in the aftermath of the Second World War that it'll happen. And the United States is still at this point anti-colonial. We have an anti-colonial tradition. And so, Roosevelt in particular is looking at the French and saying, you have mismanaged this colony. It's been an oppressive regime. You need to work towards at least gradual devolution of power in the colonies. He had said the same thing to Churchill, by the way, and eventually moved off of it because Churchill was not going to have it in terms of presiding over the end of the empire. But the United States was still adhering to that kind of tradition. What's particularly interesting, and then there's been a lot of great work that's been done specifically on this, is how the French were able to convince the United States that the situation in Vietnam and Vietnamese communists were somehow tied to communists in metropolitan France at a time when the United States needed France to be particularly strong if the Soviet Union were to try to take over the continent, and how they were able to tie the health of the two close together. And so that happens over time. And what we've seen in a lot of these histories is it happens through these diplomatic efforts and the French talking to the United States. What we also see is it happens through intelligence. Some of it is colonial officials who are, as I put it, kind of whispering in the ears of US officials who are on the ground. US officials who are saying, I'm not sure that Ho Chi Minh is really, the communism is the problem, but for the French, they're making a big deal out of it because they're worried about national liberation. But these are the same people who are saying, this guy is a communist, and we need this colony. If you want us to be strong to stand up to the Soviets, then obviously you need to support us in Indochina. So that happens through any various mechanisms of intelligence, but that was yet another one of those streams, and it's particularly interesting because there were already these routes of information that existed, and so that intelligence was fed through these trans-imperial routes back into the United States, and really ultimately helped to shape the narrative that the United States had to support the French war effort. And of course, as we know, by 1950, they're pretty much bankrolling the entire French war effort in Vietnam. The war starts in earnest in December of 1946. And then the United States was poised later to, as one historian has put it, assume the burden with our own war in Vietnam later.
So that's great to use the colonies and what happened with the colonies and return to France. So you had laid out the two different intelligence pictures, basically. And one picture coming from the military intelligence services, coming from the State Department, is of, again, this communist monolith. It's going to take over France, perhaps through violence, but even through an election, that would be just as bad. The Soviets are pulling the strings. And then the other picture, the OSS picture, which is France is actually quite resilient. It's not as weak as you think. We work with communists. You can work with them. They're more nationalist than they are communist, which, as you just pointed out with Ho Chi Minh, was the case for him as well. So how then did one picture come to win? What happened in the United States, at least in the policy-making machine, which obviously still concerns us, how intelligence influenced policy? What happened here in the Beltway where, during the Second World War, a lot of the real intel fights were in DC, not overseas? And how did that picture emerge as the winning picture, I guess, with the consequences that you just talked about? Communism is a monolith. We need to get involved in Vietnam. In other words, this had dire consequences for how the U.S. pursued the rest of the Cold War.
It did, and I would argue that a couple of the things that I've raised already were the real turning points. Roosevelt's death and Truman's becoming president of the United States made a huge difference in terms of what intelligence would look like. I don't think historians have firmly agreed on whether the OSS would have been allowed to continue under Roosevelt, because he was a bit of an enigma, if you will, in terms of whether he had clearly articulated the need for a centralized intelligence organization after the end of the war. But he also hadn't said that the OSS should disappear. And the OSS had a lot of support from people on the ground like Eisenhower, who appreciated the work that they were doing and how important they had been, especially in their liaison with the French resistance. But Roosevelt leaves the scene. Truman comes onto the scene. He has a completely different perception of the OSS. He does not like Donovan. He thinks he is posturing. He thinks he's a bit of a prima donna who's looking for attention. And so Truman makes a pretty startling decision, if you will, to disband the entire OSS and to farm out its different functions to the State Department and the War Department in 1945 with basically no warning. And so with the disbandment of the OSS, that narrative, that whether you think it's right or wrong, at least offered an alternative to what was going on in France, and an alternative interpretation, that largely disappears. And so the people inside the OSS who had been part of the research and analysis function, been writing a lot of these really insightful reports and connecting with the resistance, they end up over at the State Department in what we would know today as the Bureau of Intelligence and Research. So it's still a fantastic, deep thinking function of the State Department, but they themselves said that they felt largely marginalized. And the State Department thought that they were an information bureau themselves, so why do they need these intelligence people running around? And there was also some fear that there were maybe some leftists and communists or communist sympathizers in the OSS that might now be in the State Department. So that group and that narrative with it were largely marginalized. And so what you have is a situation where Harry Truman doesn't like the State Department, he doesn't like Donovan, and so what prevails? It's military intelligence and the narrative that came with that. So one of his main advisors was not the Secretary of State. It was Admiral William Leahy, who had been ambassador to Vichy and was now the chief of staff. So all the intelligence that Truman was getting was largely filtered through Admiral Leahy, who had a particular background and belief about France. And so that's really how one narrative wins out. It's a lot of bureaucratic knife fighting, a lot of it inside the Beltway, because those who were on the ground, with the exception of some of those who were in the embassy in Paris, really did have a different interpretation. What was going on in Vietnam, what was going on in North Africa, the strength and resilience of the French resistance in particular. And so that's kind of how that Cold War narrative took root. And of course, it has consequences for what the United States thought about France, how the United States would intervene in French affairs for the next 50 years. It has consequences for our relationship with them today. So Charles de Gaulle is no longer with us, but there are plenty of Gaullists who are still out there in France who haven't forgotten how they believe that Charles de Gaulle was treated and how the United States perceives France. So it's been important.
So that helps, establish the contours of the history. Turning to intelligence with, lessons learned or what we can derive from this history. What I'm hearing especially is it sounds like, would you say the OSS sort of had the right picture, generally speaking? Because, obviously in intelligence, you're trying to say who has the best intelligence picture. And it sounded like the OSS actually had a better grasp of domestic politics in France, international relations, certainly with respect to the colonies. And so I guess I'm interested in is why did the OSS, aside from that they were allied with the resistance, they probably saw it on the ground. But analytically speaking, we talked about the collection, the sources, but analytically speaking, why did the OSS establish that picture compared to, whatever the analytical offices were within the military intelligence services and the State Department?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And in terms of the OSS, as I mentioned before, a lot of the OSS officers already had a lot of deep experience. And I'm particularly talking about France, but this was true for the OSS desk that was dealing with Germany and obviously Japan and other important powers. So that academic background, quite honestly, the language skills, having lived in France, gave them a bit of a better appreciation in my estimation. They also had a more disparate group of sources, both inside France and outside of France, than did military intelligence. And I would say at this point too, it's important to note, as a former military intelligence officer, this is not me bagging on military intelligence at all, but at this point in American history, you had a lot of people doing intelligence as a side job. Military attachés were often appointed for political reasons rather than the fact that they had particular knowledge of the area that they were going. They didn't often have a lot of training in the areas where they were sent. And the networks that they had cultivated were largely within networks they had established through, war colleges and things like that. So it's not particularly surprising that they had a particular view of what was going on in France. But certainly I would argue that the OSS view was perhaps more nuanced. And that's where we tend to get into a little bit of difficulty in intelligence in general, where there's no gray area that it's either, they're all communists or they're not. The Soviets are trying to take over Western Europe or they're not. This was certainly not what the OSS was saying. They were saying there were reasons to be concerned about the Soviet Union. Don't forget, they had already engaged in all of these horrendous purges, famine in Ukraine. This was not exactly put up as a paragon of virtue from a number of these analysts, but they were saying the situation is a bit more complicated. And we know that there is not the direct relationship that you might expect between the French Communist Party at that time. It would be more direct later. And the Soviets, and perhaps there was a potential there to split the French communists off from the Soviet Union. And they also saw that heavy-handed American intervention was not particularly welcome or received among our allies. So some of it has to do with the pedigree of the individual officers themselves, and some of it has to do with their sources in terms of appreciating what was going on. But the political dynamics inside France were particularly challenging. And if you're looking at it from the outside, it would be pretty easy to say communist, non-communist. Quite obviously, we support the non-communists. But without realizing the further deep context as to why the French might find communism in particular appealing, that's where the OSS really provided that kind of nuanced analysis.
And, I wanted to add too, so you look at the book and it's clear that you have both the intelligence professionals and the intelligence studies scholars' eye. One point you mentioned, I think it was Ludwig Montague, who said there was another problem that they had, which is there was a shift in analysis. This is around the time that Truman comes out with the daily summary, or the CIG comes out with a daily summary for Truman, the antecedent to the president's daily brief. So there was a shift to current intelligence. And what he says happened with the case of France is they stopped doing long-term sort of strategic intelligence on the political context, and it was more, really short-term. Is it going to fall or is it going to not fall? And I thought that was just, great insight to just have in there. There's so many lessons here for contemporary intelligence studies. But looking at the analyst-policymaker relationship here, you mentioned Leahy and how it almost sounds like no amount of OSS analysis, no matter how good it was ever going to reach the person that it needed to reach. So, for intelligence officers, what can you do in this environment? And I'm kind of looking at best practices today and that analyst-policymaker relationship. What can you do when you have recalcitrant officials like that who already have predetermined outlooks? This is the plight of American intelligence, is you have to stay objective. You're not really supposed to engage in the political game and the backroom dealings and maneuvering. So was there any hope in this case to actually get the better intelligence picture to the president? Was Truman up in the air? Would he have even tolerated that picture of the Soviet Union as not bent on protracted conflict and everything that we associate with the Cold War? Or was this just destined to happen because of who were the big people in the room in DC?
So personalities do matter. And one of the things that I teach in my U.S. intelligence history course at NIU is the relationship with the president. As much as I'm an advocate for bottom-up history, the relationship with the president and intelligence really does matter. So it's hard to imagine a scenario where, based on the personalities, that Donovan perhaps could have broken through to Truman. There were examples later on. Hoyt Vandenberg, who was one of the early directors of Central Intelligence, who was an Air Force general, was widely respected and was able to complicate certain narratives sometimes when he would talk to Leahy or Truman. And so I guess my advice would be not to consider any of it foreclosed if you can't break through to a particular policymaker. I think Richard Emmerman was the one, I'm sure I'm not getting this quote correctly, but he talks about policymakers and political figures as cognitively impaired and politically possessed, and they're always going to be there. But I think the biggest lesson, and we have learned this lesson over and over and over again, is not to bend to political will. One of the things that's interesting about the OSS intelligence was it wasn't exactly policy neutral. That was not a thing yet. So you did have advocacy coming out of the OSS, and some of it was interesting because it was basically saying this American policy is disastrous. And the reason we know it is because we've been talking to these people and through our intelligence networks and reports. By the time Sherman-Kent rolls around later in the 1940s, there's all this talk about, the policy, divide. I think it's probably pretty important that the intelligence community keeps to that divide. But we've also seen time and time again where intelligence has potentially been politicized because it doesn't meet, or it's been shaped to meet the prerogatives of a particular administration. So as unsatisfying an answer as it is, I think, you continue speaking the truth to power, avoid the temptations of bending in the face of political pressure, and the intelligence community needs to maintain its objectivity and its rigor.
And being a historian as well, I like bottom of history, but unfortunately, what the lessons we get from American intelligence history are big personalities, rivalries, bureaucratic politics. I did see a little bit of hope, though, because to my mind, when I was reading the book and looking at all the instances where individuals were making decisions, again, it goes to people choosing their sources and already having predetermined biases. And are you in the field or are you in a soiree in a salon in Paris? And so, perhaps part of the solution too is were people willing to go look at different sources as an individual, whether it's a case officer or an intelligence professional or an individual analyst, were they willing to tolerate an alternative viewpoint and then carry that up within their organization? And how much room is there or should there be for divergent thinking? Because it sounds like the OSS allowed it, but the hardened bureaucratic departments, the old departments that had already fixed on their protocols, their policies, the people that they select and promote, they didn't. So, what lessons does that offer for today as well? Especially now that intelligence is much more hardened and bureaucratic and formally organized than it was at the Second World War with the OSS.
Yeah, there are definitely some instances where you can see a little bit more of flexibility on the part of the OSS. Now, they were accused at times of being leftist because it was full of these academics and that perhaps there were communists amongst the ranks. And Donovan had been very clear that, I don't really care what your color is in terms of, as he put it, pink or red, but obviously the aim was to defeat the Nazis. In terms of, kind of navigating those waters today, what was your question again?
It was sort of, what does the intelligence professional, how does the intelligence professional navigate institutions and organizations that might be fairly rigid bureaucratically and not tolerate divergent thinking, but that's precisely what intelligence exists for.
Yeah, thank you for the cue. I had a senior moment there for a second. But what I thought was particularly interesting on the OSS's case is that they would acknowledge if there was a contrary view. And they may not agree with it, but they would say, hey, this is out there and let's acknowledge it. There were also instances on the other side where if there was a contrary view that said something positive about communism, they actually moved to suppress some of those reports. So that in and of itself is a particular problem. And this was not a day of competitive analysis either, and we've gotten so much better in terms of analytic standards. So to some degree, bureaucracy does have a role, and I cringe when I say that because I fight bureaucracy every day. But it has a role in those kinds of standards and analytic objectivity that we have really been pushing over the last 20 years, since 9/11. But of course, none of that existed at the time. So what was particularly alarming is a case where you might have Admiral Leahy who decides he doesn't want to hear any more out of what's now called IRIS, which is what we would know as INR today, to become the OSS parts in the State Department. I don't want to hear any more of your reports. Please don't send them to me anymore. So you can already see, the dilemmas there in terms of how you, kind of navigate those bureaucracies. We're doing a lot better today, but we still have to navigate the political winds, which can be difficult at times. But I think in terms of lessons learned, it is, to make sure that those levels of dissent are being acknowledged, that obviously when we do PDBs, that's a community kind of assessment, but it also has to be coordinated over months, years at sometimes. But that's an incredibly important function. And there were also times later in this period where, the dissent in what would become the PDB, these were estimates, so the CIA was actually improving in terms of creating these national estimates. There was dissent from IRIS at the time. that was important, but it's unclear whether the policymakers actually took that into account. But that part is especially important to know. And we're still, even though we have these bureaucratic mechanisms in place, it's often that you get a particular narrative that can be shaped based on political whims. So we have to be extremely careful over that.
Yeah, and just to emphasize that last point, the outstanding thing the book does is shows just how long-term setting this scene for the policymaker was in terms of framing the Cold War. And you wonder after you read the book and you think about the OSS estimate, it didn't necessarily have to be this way in a lot of places. I have a million questions in intelligence, historians, like there's little intricate historical questions I could ask, but I wanted to open it up to the audience and the audience on Zoom.
Thanks, Jeff. Hey, thanks, Susan. Great presentation. You got me thinking a couple things that I think are relevant for today, for our students, for practitioners. I think when you were talking about the OSS, the importance of strategic empathy, the importance of them understanding the nuances and how Ho Chi Minh was a nationalist before a communist. And then also, if I'm understanding you right, the value of history in thinking of today, but also the abuse of history and making a case for why we should do something today. I mentioned that because, it was either you or Jeff had mentioned, the domino effect and the communist monolith. Mm-hmm. Today I'm a little concerned because we've made done this similar, I think, with China. I would argue, during the GWAT, we kind of neglected understanding China. We've now switched positions to say we have to do something. But what has been absent the entire time is truly understanding China. So now what we have done is we've made them the monolith. Any action that we see that they do, we think it's some brilliant wizard with evil intent behind the scenes. So for example, I saw an article the other week talking about Chinese aged military males on our southern border. They're going to come in and take us all out. No consideration about what domestically is going into China with COVID and stuff like that. So just wanted to get, apologize for the diatribe, but just wanted to get your view on the importance of a nuanced understanding of history and not just this surface one to make a case that we need to do something.
You're speaking my language. So this is something that I bring up in my classes all the time. One of the things about intelligence history, as I say to intelligence professionals, is you need to know your history. And it needs to be more than surface deep and more than Munich analogies, the same analogies that political figures will often use and misuse, shall we say. So I think that is absolutely incredibly important. One of the things that's interesting when we think about the new monolith, if we think about China that way, when we were thinking about the Soviet Union and perhaps its involvement in France during this particular time period, there was always this concern. The Soviets were advocating a worldwide revolution, and they did it once. And so if I'm thinking in terms of linear history, then I'm going to assume at the end of the Second World War that that's precisely what they're trying to do. And in fact, that wasn't exactly what they were trying to do. And so that inevitability piece, am I worried about war with China? Absolutely. Are they the adversary? Absolutely. But it doesn't necessarily mean that it's time to start foreclosing options and making conclusions, because just as, perhaps an ideological confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union was not too surprising, the course and the shape that the Cold War took was not inevitable. Those were all decision points that were made to some degree based on an appreciation of contemporary events or a lack of appreciation of historical events that might explain, for example, why Stalin was so fearful of being encircled, something that Vladimir Putin is still worried about to this day. The same thing is true for communists in terms of the monolith, with whether we're thinking about China and Vietnam today, we're thinking about China and the Soviet Union and Vietnam then. Ho Chi Minh was appealing to the United States. He didn't get what he wanted from the United States. He goes to the Soviet Union. Stalin basically says, no, I don't want to deal with this right now. I'm trying to maintain my relationship with my allies in 1946 and 1947. It's not really until 1950 that he even recognizes Vietnam's struggle for independence. So that's an opportunity right there that's gone. to split these groups from whether it's their previous Chinese overlords that the Vietnamese had very much struggled to get out from under. And by the way, they haven't forgotten that when you think about Vietnam's relationship with China today. Or you think about the particular relationship that the Vietnamese had with the Soviet Union then. So again, you can't fully appreciate those kinds of patterns if you don't understand the broad context and the history. History also offers something for us to apply to our contemporary thinking. I don't like the history repeats itself business. We hear it too much. And I can't remember who actually said it, but it's been attributed to Mark Twain. It wasn't him, but the idea that history rhymes. But there is a lot of insight that we can gain from history that informs our contemporary issues. So it's incredibly important that we have that deeper context, but that we also don't fall into the trap of linear thinking, that if this happened then it is going to happen the same way now, or that the same thing is happening.
Well, and I'll add there, that's where I think the agency piece is so important. Not the agency as far as human intelligence officers, because again, what I really like that you do is you establish what the stakes were, not just in the short term, but the long term for that Cold War picture. And to Dave's point on studying history, so as far as teaching history for intelligence professionals or teaching history for practitioners, one thing that academics have is, we're interested in conceptualization and practitioners are interested in implementation. So, now you hear about applied history, for instance. How do you think you go about really emphasizing that non-surface level history to practitioners who also, they're occupied with, they're in the trenches and they say, but you don't understand, like my requirements are current intelligence and my promotion depends on this, or I come from this particular organization and this is what we look at. Where's the role for human agency, and especially emphasizing and teaching it and really stressing how great the consequences can be?
Yeah, so I would say this is a challenge. It's a military challenge, it's an intelligence challenge, but where do you get time to do that kind of deep thinking that allows you to think through these things? Because when you're in the field or you're on the job, we really don't have time to think through a lot of these things. That's the important role that a place like NIU and a place like JSOU plays, to give people the time and space to be thinking about those kinds of things. And without the opportunity for that deeper context, it's your analysts are already at a disadvantage. This is something, and I can say this as someone who came into military service prior to 9/11, the analysis training that we got was basically nil. And any broader context that you appreciated was because you had decided on your own to read. The military system, through Joint Professional Military Education, does a better job of lifelong learning for its military professionals. The intelligence community, we're getting there. But unless we start affording those kinds of opportunities for people to develop that deeper knowledge, so that it's there and can inform them no matter whether their problem set is China or whether their problem set is Russia, or how to better use AI on the battlefield, that they've got that broader intellectual grounding and framework to be able to do that. So that's something that we're definitely trying to work on at NIU.
And that piece also brings up, so now you mentioned in the 1940s, Second World War, we didn't have intelligence professionals. There was a great quote in there, I think it was from Marshall, talking about, hey, military, you don't actually do intelligence. There is something called intelligence professionalism. You have to be very careful. And the OSS, as you mentioned, when you look at it, they're just drawing people in who aren't intelligence professionals themselves, but it seemed like they got a better grasp of the land. So, let's just say, looking at how people follow a professional intelligence trajectory, at least in terms of the military, for instance, recruited at a relatively young age, maybe a college degree. In other words, they don't have what the OSS RNA had, which is they're bringing in PhDs. Mm-hmm. They're bringing in older people with already deep subject matter expertise. So it seems to me that that's a challenge, not only for the military, but also for the intelligence community, as far as when it comes to recruitment, training, who you bring in, what they bring in as far as their experience. And then even if there's a role for certain bureaucratic standards and protocols, like we're going to teach you structured analytic techniques and but does that really make you an analyst? What really makes a good analyst? What makes a good operations officer as far as having the worldliness to understand what circle they're in and that person's political context, cultural context? Because what I guess I'm getting at is, are we recruiting and training people the right way for intelligence? We've come far in some ways, but in other ways, maybe there's more to still be done there.
That's a really good question, and one that we're constantly grappling at. I'm looking at my NIU colleagues with this one. One of the things that, with the OSS, there's nothing like an existential crisis to loosen up the wheels of bureaucracy. So, the OSS could bring people in. There was not really a concern about political affiliations or anything like that. It was whether they had the requisite knowledge, and you had people beating down the doors because they wanted to serve. And that was a way that they could do it. Part of our problems these days are bureaucratic challenges. We live in a universe where people don't always generationally want to come in and sign up for 30 years of government service. They might want to move in and out of government service. So how do you do that and manage the onerous security clearance process that we've been talking about fixing for 20 years and we're still working on it? And how do we recruit people at a time when they can make a lot more money on the outside? So really, it's an appeal to patriotism, which is fantastic, but we also want to get people with that cutting edge knowledge who are willing to spend, if not an entire career, at least some time in the community making it better. So to some degree, if we could return to the days where the bureaucracy wasn't quite as entrenched, because oddly enough, our bureaucracies today still looks a lot like, for all of the talk of flattened organizations, it still looks like a lot like it did in 1947, at least in terms of the intelligence community. And so loosening up the levers, we've had to learn this lesson over and over again. Think 9/11 with Arabic speakers, Urdu speakers. So cultivating the people who have those kinds of academic skills, who have those language skills, and developing those partnerships, so whether they can support government or whether they can come all the way into government. I think there are probably some lessons to be learned from the World War II era because it wasn't as difficult, and we shouldn't have to wait for an existential crisis to be able to do something.
Then, we kind of beat up on the intelligence community. How about beating up on some politicians or policymakers? What about educating the policymaker and trying again, because you are shaping someone's worldview, there's a lot of talk about like operational code analysis and how policymakers have instrumental beliefs and philosophical beliefs. Philosophical beliefs, this is how I view the world and what I want it to be. Instrumental beliefs, this is how I'm going to go about achieving it. And, intelligence certainly fits into both. So, this is something that intelligence studies tackles all the time, but intelligence practitioners, and including in the military when you're talking to people, let's say, an intelligence briefing, a senior figure, someone who's going to make a decision, what if you know that their worldview is somewhat entrenched? Or even if it isn't, if they're somewhat agnostic, if they're on the fence, how do you educate policymakers about the uses and limits of intelligence, the challenges that an intelligence analyst face? Policymakers have their challenges, time, needing to actually make a decision. But analysts are also challenged by, well, I need more time, or I'm not telling you to make a decision, I'm just trying to. In other words, there's a conflict there too, that it seems like, again, just like shaping the right intelligence officer, how do you produce policymakers who are receptive to intelligence that they might not like to hear?
Boy, that's a tough one that I don't know that anybody has solved. And I think, looking over the span of intelligence history, obviously you have presidents who come at intelligence from different perspectives. So we had our very first president who was particularly adept, George Washington that is, particularly adept at using intelligence. We had others that almost had no knowledge of intelligence, and they have to be kind of brought along. And what's generally what the most effective route is to find a way that is appealing to them. And we know from those who do the PDB that you often have to tailor the PDB to the personality and preferences of the president. So you will have some that do not want to hear anything that's more than 2 pages. And so you have to figure out how to get it into 2 pages. But also to pick up on where their areas of interests are, and to take those opportunities to set up longer deep dives into different particular areas. But it is particularly difficult to overcome entrenched worldviews of political figures. We all have them, but of course theirs are particularly important in terms of shaping how intelligence is used or not used. But I would say the most important thing that the intelligence community can do is to inform, so that those decisions, even if they choose to disregard intelligence, are made having had all the different aspects of the problem put forward by people who do think about it every day, do understand the deeper context. So that those, because ultimately that's what intelligence is doing. They're informing decision makers so they can make the best decisions that they can. We can't help it if they're politically possessed, but providing that kind of deeper context. And that's another important part of history, because there is this tendency to draw from these lessons in history to make a point. And I mentioned before the Munich analogy, that's always one of appeasement. But providing, even in terms of in those interactions with political figures, so they can understand without the long monologue on the historical background, they can understand, why is Vladimir Putin approaching Ukraine in the way that he is. It's not just as simple as what's happened in the last couple of years. It's a deeply entrenched worldview that was formed during the Cold War when he was a KGB station chief in Dresden. So explaining some of those things perhaps makes them more educated, but they don't have time to do all the research and think about it in the ways that we do. So that's incumbent upon us to at least provide it.
Yeah, well, historians and academics, the problem is like, why say in 10 words what you can say in 100? And that's the last thing, a policymaker wants to hear is, tell me what I need to know right now. It's like, well, let's start at the very beginning, France in the French Revolution. And, I think that the value, and I certainly got it from your book, because it framed France's responsibility as an ally, as a partner, as struggling to maintain great power status, but certainly not going to be at the same level as, say, the US and USSR, just shows the importance of that. And when I think about the contemporary international climate, there's a lot of that resonates with your book. So, for instance, one of the questions that we had was studying this history, and the Roman author Tacitus, he was a historian, said that you need to study small events, because out of those small events, that's why great things happen. And I got that from reading your book, certainly. How do you convince policymakers and intelligence officers alike of that? It's like the focus is on current intelligence, but they may not actually understand or appreciate completely just how current intelligence and current events are going to inform that long-range picture. So aside from making a plug for the book and saying read the book so that way you understand this, how do you convey to both audiences that particular problem set? Is like, you want to make a decision right now, and it is going to have long-term consequences in ways that are actually foreseeable, but perhaps you're not looking at that long-term picture, even though the OSS has it right there and they're waving in your face.
So, in terms of, I think it obviously it can be worked into the analysis itself, but it of course has to be really succinct. It can be worked into the conversations that you're having with policymakers. It can be worked into the background materials. But I will also say and I'll say this broadly because I don't want to go outside of the purview of this classroom and step into my other government role, is that we have been doing a better job, even if it's in call-out boxes, for example, in providing some of that key historical turning points or context, because there is at least an appreciation that policymakers need to understand, why, in a leadership study, for example, why a particular leader might be approaching a problem a particular way. And of course, that's really important in mitigating these mirror imaging in particular, because it's like, why I think the rational thing to do would be this, and I would do this. And in fact, that person may not be behaving rationally and certainly isn't coming at it with the same background that you are. So I'll give an example from the Cold War that doesn't have to do with France, but in terms of understanding Gorbachev's opening to the West. There was a lack of appreciation that he had actually been formed as a young communist functionary in the era of Nikita Khrushchev and what was considered to be an era of opening. So 1956, when, Khrushchev, the secret speech, when he details some of Stalin's crimes, and that Gorbachev had been a university student at that time, and that had actually informed his views and explained to some degree why in the 1980s he would take this dramatic change for perestroika and to open up to the West. But there were a lot of people who didn't fully appreciate about Gorbachev. They saw him as he is a communist. He is presiding over what is essentially a communist empire. And why would he be doing anything that he thinks that could perhaps bring about dissolution or a collapse? And so it's those moments, like you said, I mean, without the long historical diatribe that, really have to be pinpointed for these decision makers so they can, not fall into a lot of these cognitive traps that we still wrestle with.
And that takes a lot of deep dive. In order to get those small, crucial inflection points, you have to understand a big, broad swath of history in depth. Are there more questions? Yes.
So, good afternoon, Dr. Perlman. Chief Cody Herr. I'm the Russia branch chief across the street at SOCOM and one of your former students. So, one comment and one question. I think the question kind of continues along the same vein we currently have. My comment is, as you mentioned in the beginning, reading the book, I saw definitely some clear implications for great power competition, integrated deterrence, even some things that we're wrestling with currently today, such as Ukraine. And specifically, I'm thinking about what you discussed in terms of biased analyses, then impacting policymaking, and then suddenly becomes the accepted narrative going forward. And one way it happens, of course, as you mentioned in the book, is the way that emotional bias can play a role in individual analysts and how they look at particular problems. It's something that Barbara Rosenwein discussed and you mentioned in the introduction in the book. Another one, I think, though, is recency bias. So you talk about how France was viewed as very weak politically, militarily, given what happened in the opening stages of World War II, and how that sort of colored that analytic line, if you will, of folks thinking, okay, they're just going to roll over to this communist threat. The parallel I see is Ukraine. And where the IC analytic line was the Ukrainian military would collapse in 72 hours, Russia would take Kyiv. That was a standard analytic line across the board. I mean, there weren't really a whole lot of dissenting voices, myself included, or my team at SOCOM. And I think a lot of that was recency bias again. Afghanistan had just went down, so we saw the Afghan army evaporate overnight, and we thought, hey, this is probably the way things are going to go for Ukraine, given similarities in corruption, weak military, et cetera. So given that, my question is, so at the individual analyst level, so how do we gird against some of these biases? Because I suspect that it's more than tradecraft. I suspect that it's more than just avoidance of policy prescription, and some of the things we've talked about. So at the individual level, is there something deeper, something that transcends analytic tradecraft that we can look at to try to break out of these biases that the entire community, for example, in the Ukraine crisis, fell victim to?
So that's a very good question. And I think I even referenced this in the book, was, and I think it's Roger George who made this point, so I'm not putting this forward as my own, but one of the deeper issues is the mindset rigidity. And so coming into it with a perceived idea of whether it's a particular group that you might be dealing with or a particular country. And if I'm being biased as an educator, the way to mitigate the effects of mindset rigidity are through education. We can teach people all of the analytic standards and tradecraft that we want, but if they don't have a mind that is expansive enough to absorb new information and make sense of it, then it becomes a bit more difficult. What's kind of interesting too is, and I'm thinking of a World War II example with Japan, is that we never had people on the inside in Japan. And so when we were surprised about what the Imperial Japanese government was doing or not doing, even the ambassador said, don't blame me, we don't have any insight into what's going on inside Japan. And so if you look at those who write about explaining Pearl Harbor, for example, they'll say that it's not noise, it's not any particular thing. Some of it is that we don't have well-placed people who can give us the broader political, economic, social context that we require to be able to fully understand a society. So that's not something that particular analytic techniques is going to satisfy either, but it is about having well-placed people who have that kind of broad understanding, cultivating it. So I guess my larger answer would be education and the engagement and networks piece of building upon the knowledge that is already out in the world without believing that you have to somehow be the expert and process it. Because ultimately, I think we've talked about heuristics. They ultimately get processed based on what kind of framework that you have. But it's, to some degree, the question is, how expansive is your framework? And how are you capable of absorbing that kind of information? Thank you. And hello.
Yeah.
Sir.
Kind of goes along with what was just brought up, but so in the military we talk about civilian control of the military. Right? So from an ethical perspective, can you talk about how you balance dealing with a politician who has a worldview, but yet analysts have their particular biases? So how do you not allow your biases to overwhelm your professional ability?
Yeah, I mean, I think some of that comes through recognizing what your biases are, and the assumptions that are underlaying your appreciation of a particular event. And quite often, we can talk about all of the different techniques we want, but at its core, if you're not willing to say, what is it that I am actually assuming about the scenario? So thinking about Ukraine, what are the assumptions that I'm making about Ukraine's ability to withstand Russian onslaught? And then, I think running for lack of a better way of putting it, running through the traps of those mechanisms that we have put in place to make sure that one person's cognitive bias isn't dictating an analytic line, if you will. So there are ways that we have tried to mitigate those effects in the last 20 years, whether it has to do with deep sourcing on different documents in ways that we didn't have to do before. I will tell you, a problem during the Cold War was something that I had referred to as circular reporting. I think others have too, but I saw this as an intelligence officer in the lead up to the Iraq War, which was, I'm going to take a piece over here that one organization has written, I'm going to add some stuff to it, and I'm going to put it back out. And there weren't the sourcing standards at the time, and so now I appear to be another organization that is reinforcing an established line. So there are things that we have developed in terms of rigor for these kinds of analysis and assessments that helps to catch those kinds of things, whether it's competitive analysis, red teaming, having others, even others in the office, the sourcing, having other people be able to comment and challenge your assessments. So I think that's part of it. In terms of political figures, hard to know what to do. But what's interesting about political figures is often the bureaucracy is the protection. The thing that we most malign and decry sometimes is the protection against epic change that's attempted at the top of a particular political figures because, it is so entrenched. So perhaps not a satisfying answer, unfortunately.
Just an observation, I want to get your thoughts on, you talk about education. We had this discussion upstairs. I think we see it the same. It's about nurturing practitioners throughout a career. And I think back a lot of times in the military, I'm critical of PME in general. A lot of times it becomes advocacy instead of education. And to say it another way, maybe, I think we're very good at maybe nurturing creative thinking, but we're very poor at nurturing critical thinking. And the distinction to me is I see people coming up with very brilliant solutions or perceived brilliant solutions, very creative in it. But they haven't established the understanding. They haven't been critical. They've accepted on its surface a narrative, right? And they're being creative in responding in that environment. And so we lack the critical that should come as the first component, the first element, before they actually apply that creativity.
Agreed. No, and I will say, again, from the education perspective, that's one of the benefits of education. And of course, at NIU, we have a bachelor's program. The core of what we do is a master's and post-baccalaureate certificates. And one of our institutional learning outcomes is critical thinking. for that very reason, that the problem set you may be working on today is not necessarily going to be the one that you're working on 5 years from now. And so what is perhaps more important in terms of people who are able to think about different problems is that intellectual foundation that gives them the tools, not necessarily tools for cyber or tools for China, but the intellectual tools to be able to make sense of whatever the situation is around them, and to have the research skills to be able to go out and seek the kind of information that perhaps you don't have and the different ways to absorb it. So I think the critical thinking piece is really important. And I would say too, at the high school level and at the undergraduate level in traditional institutions, we're seeing a dearth of critical thinking, and it's manifesting itself in graduate programs to this day. So part of me believes that we really do, as a society, have to return to the basics so that we are cultivating people, whether they go into government service or not, that are really able to, think through complex problems. What I've described in this book, there are so many different streams that are going into these narratives and thoughts that they're really difficult to untangle. To some degree, when you're writing a book, you have to make it a little bit, the publisher will always say, well, what would you call this group? And what would you call this group? And, I'm writing back, well, it's a little bit more complicated than that. But we need people who can think through those kinds of complexities, especially in intelligence, because our policymakers don't have the time to do it. So whatever product you're giving them on the end, it should be the product of that kind of critical thinking.
Hi there, I'm Kimberly Irvin. I'm here in JSOU, but I also teach for these guys as an adjunct over at NIU.
Thank you.
I am a cultural anthropologist. Welcome. I'm happy to be involved in both. I'm a cultural anthropologist. I look at China as well as Africa. So I'm mostly East Africa in terms of the French, obviously, they had more of a role and still do in West Africa. So as an anthropologist, what you are saying about, the context, history really matters, really resonates with me. And I'm curious about, if you could talk a little bit about the local level. So we talk a lot about the state, right? But what about the local players? Because I have to get in, I have to look at, say, DEOs and their organization, and I look at tribal elements that, while we're calling them low intensity conflicts, there's nothing low intensity about this. These animosities and alliances are very important to determining the outcome of these various threat situations across the world. So if you could just talk a little bit about, particularly French intelligence, operating at a more local level.
Yeah, so that is that's a really good question. And one of the things that I was striving to do with this book was to get more at the local level, because so much of what we think about intelligence is that national level piece that is sitting on Truman's desk. And in reality, if you trace it all the way back to its origin, a lot of it is based on local context. So, and I think in particular, I've already talked a little bit about the OSS and their relationship with the resistance, which would be considered more local because these were people that were operating literally behind enemy lines inside France. But in thinking about the colonies in particular, it became really a really important piece to the narrative, because what was coming out of local actors was entirely different than some of the narratives that were circulating inside Washington. So when we talk about communist monoliths or bureaucratic monoliths, even the State Department was not a monolith in terms of their thinking on France. You had people who were in the European Bureau inside the State Department who were worried about France as a bulwark against the Soviet Union in Europe. You had those in the Asian Bureau who were more worried about what was happening in Indochina, and they had a different appreciation of the degree of American involvement. But you also had these local actors, intelligence officers who were on the ground in Indochina, for example, or in North Africa, who were directly dealing with the colonized and had a completely different appreciation of what exactly was going on. And so they understood that, for example, Ho Chi Minh was not a communist first, he was a nationalist first, and what the ultimate aims of the movement were and what they had hoped the relationship would be with the United States and ultimately with France. And they also were poised to point out flashpoints as they were coming in ways that, you know, Washington, D.C. or Paris could not possibly appreciate. What's interesting is, again, you see the same kind of bifurcation in the colonies that you saw in terms of engagement with local actors that you saw inside of France. So the OSS was often dealing directly with the Vietnamese. On the other side, what military engagement there was, were often dealing with French military officers or colonial officials who certainly had an interest in maintaining the empire. So again, those narratives that come out of both of those kind of different streams are very much cultivated locally through people who are feeding into the system. So we often had French police who were surveilling native movements inside of Indochina and North Africa, who were feeding information into US intelligence. Sometimes it was just walking over to them and handing them a piece of paper of, look at what I found on the battlefield, or, you know, look at this communist tract, and doesn't this explain everything that's going on? But one of the real flaws, I would argue, in some of the War Department intelligence was that there was no attempt to infiltrate communist groups, whether it was in the colonies or in France. And so everything that they learned about communists were tracts that had been written in the 1920s in a particularly revolutionary period, and they made an assumption that this is exactly what they're after right now. And the opposite was true with some of the OSS and other local State Department folks who were on the ground, who were directly dealing with Vietnamese communists, Vietnamese nationalists, and all of the different groups, because that whole political situation was very diverse as well. So quite obviously, the local does matter. So that part of this history, there's a top-down element to it. You can't get away from the president, but there is also a bottom-up, because a lot of this information was actually bubbling up from a lot of these contacts with local groups.
And with just a few minutes, I had to pick up on that, because a question that was pressing, and I didn't mention it, is another thing is there's a difference between treating the symptoms versus the disease. And what you had mentioned in terms of how we perceive communism, it definitely applies with our approach to terrorism too, is you're looking at communists and communism, terrorists, terrorism, as opposed to why do people go in that direction. You mentioned in terms of Indochina, it's because Ho Chi Minh at certain points in time was asking for American help, and it's like, no, you're communist, we can't help you. But what he was asking for was more based on national affiliation and ideology. And in France, you talk about the strikes, and France, it had been destroyed by the Second World War. So, communism purported to offer things to the working class that they weren't getting due to war starvation and other issues. So, again, with again, as we run out of time, could you address our approach? Because the other issue is what intelligence chooses to focus on can also determine the policies that policymakers implement, and they may be treating the symptoms and not the disease itself.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So one of the things that's interesting is if you look at the language that intelligence officials were using in some of their documents that made their way to the president, in just a short period of 3 years, there was something like 15 coup warnings of an imminent communist coup, something like 25 warnings of an imminent revolution, dozens of warnings of an impending civil war, and ultimately they never happened. And so this is also something that I feel like I'm constantly preaching, is the lessons that you draw. So the lessons that it seems that American officials drew at the end of all of this was it didn't happen because we intervened. So we intervened in terms of the Marshall Plan, a number of different loans that were extended to the French to help with recovery. We intervened with discrete political influence and pressure on different groups to ensure that they were the ones in power. We perhaps suggested that it would be a great idea to kick the communists out of the government in May of 1947. Now, the French did that on their own. That's another historical debate. But if the lessons that are taken are, well, American intervention has obviously helped to stave off a communist revolution or a coup, then perhaps it's a great idea to keep going. And that, I would argue, directly affected American intervention in France in the decades to come and our relationship with France. So in the 1950s, after this period is all over, the Americans come up with a big psychological operations campaign to stem communist influence in France, and it was detailed. They had another one for Italy. And whether it actually succeeded or not, but this was part of CIA covert operations in terms of propaganda, the Congress for Cultural Freedom, front organizations, magazines, student groups, all in an effort to stem communism. And you often have to wonder if some of this was necessary because they had created, to some degree, a boogeyman that wasn't entirely there, or certainly wasn't aligned with the Soviet Union in the ways that they thought just yet. I also use the historical example of CIA intervention in the Italian elections in 1948. And for decades, what came out of that episode was successful. The communists didn't win, the Christian Democrats won. Look, we funneled a bunch of money in there, so we should keep doing it. And in reality, some of the more recent scholarship that's been really illuminating has shown that it was actually not really CIA intervention, but because there were local Italian actors who also didn't want the Italian communists to be elected. And so it was more of this activity on the ground. And so they were kind of misattributing this activity to the wrong actors and not allowing agency to, whether it's the French people themselves or the French government, in that case, the Italian government. So you take these lessons that support this narrative that we need to keep intervening in the internal affairs, in this case, of an ally, that when it's exposed, it causes deep, deep problems. And what I think is kind of perhaps a way of couching all of this is people often ask me about US-French relations and why they're problematic at some times. Well, I would invite them to understand this particular history because it explains a lot. I would also say we are two peoples who believe ourselves to be exceptional. And so that at its heart has informed US relations. And so you can imagine from the French perspective, if you're an exceptional power and you have Americans that are covertly intervening in your affairs, and it would only ramp up over time, that perhaps causes problems down the road.
Thank you very much, Dr. Perlman. And again, for an excellent, rich and deep case study here that has so many applications for today, and certainly a lot of lessons for, not just US foreign policy, as you said, but for intelligence and intelligence practitioners as they go about their day-to-day job. So I'd like to thank you again on behalf of JSOU. Thank you, everyone, also for your time this afternoon.
Thank you. Thanks, Jeff.